You have 24 hours to vacate this property. I read those words 3 times like someone else's cruel joke, and then like a verdict. The Ridgewood HOA letter sat in my hand. Glossy letterhead Laura Bennett's name in cursive at the bottom, my grandfather's house reduced to an ultimatum. My throat went dry, because this was the house he built with his own hands. The one he left me, the one I promised to protect. And now a piece of paper told me to leave it. I'm Michael Carter. My grandfather's picture hangs above the fireplace in his uniform. He taught me how to change a tire, how to keep a ledger, how to stand still when things get unfair. I never expected I'd have to use everything he taught me to fight my own homeowners association. It started small, an oddly specific landscaping citation. A note about a truck parked improperly. A comment about a wreath, but the tone was the same, official, polite, relentless. The first call to the HOA office set the tone. A woman with the practiced cadence of someone who eats rules for breakfast told me to buy the handbook at the office for $35. When I asked which clause I'd broken, she offered community standards and put me on hold for 3 minutes of elevator music like she was stalling for effect. I read the handbook that night until the letters blurred. Nothing in the covenants matched what they accused me of. Not a single line supported the 24-hour vacate demand. That didn't stop the letters from arriving, neat stacks of intimidation fines, deadlines, threats, each one more absurd than the last, and each stamped with the gravity of someone who believed ceremony equals authority. People who want to squeeze you out often try to make their hobby paperwork look like power. I started keeping a log. Dates, times, conversations, photos of every page they sent, photos of my yard and truck measurements of my grass, the receipt for the wreath I'd hung from the hardware store. I did what my grandfather taught me: document, document, document. And, as I built my little paper fort, patterns started to appear. I called a neighbor, Tom Parker, 3 houses down, who'd introduced himself at the funeral and whose voice now lowered to a whisper. He told me he'd seen it before a spike in enforcement when a new president took over 8 months ago. Notices piling up, a family forced to sell rather than fight. Tom's story fit a map. I began to draw 3 houses in a corridor, all flagged, all sold soon after, all bought by the same limited liability company for below-market prices. The LLC led back to a development firm, Harborview Developments, whose glossy renderings made it obvious what they wanted: a corridor, contiguous lots, a bigger project. The files I found in the county office showed a disclosure 3 years old with the president's name. Laura Bennett listed as a consultant for firms that matched Harborview's address. That disclosure was there when it didn't matter. When she became president, the disclosure was gone. That's the part that made my skin crawl. A disappearance, a pattern, a series of enforcement actions timed like a predator circling. And then things escalated the way bullies escalate when they sense fear. Notices multiplied: 610, then 16 violations cataloged across weeks, each with a fine, each threatening liens. The HOA's attorney sent a letter for $700 due within 10 days, or they'd place a lien and begin foreclosure. The lights went out one Thursday afternoon. I checked the breaker. The neighbors' houses were lit, and the utility company told me with bewildering formality that my service had been disconnected at the HOA's request because of an electrical hazard. There had been no inspection, no notice, just a signed piece of paper that looked official. I sat in the cold and watched the refrigerator go dark and felt the slow unspooling of normal life. No heat, no running water at night, no way to charge a phone if I had to document something fast. They weren't trying to win a court case. They were trying to make the house unlivable. For a few long days, I had that feeling that creeps into the center of you and squeezes. Maybe I was the problem. Maybe there was something I'd missed. I packed a bag, booked a cheap hotel, and told myself I'd stay away until this blew over. I sat on the edge of the bed in a fluorescent-lit room and pictured my grandfather's stooped hands holding a hammer and thought, no. Not like this. I couldn't quit because quitting would mean letting someone rewrite what my family had built in their own image. The doubt didn't disappear overnight. There were nights I lay awake and wondered whether my stubbornness would cost me more than the house's worth: relationships, money, my sanity. But every time the doubt crept in, another piece of paper whispered the truth. I had a pattern, and patterns can be proved. I started making calls I'd been avoiding out of sheer spite: county clerks, the assessor's office, the library microfiche. I pulled deeds and minutes and photocopied disclosure forms until the study looked like a law office. I found purchase dates below market sales, a commercial filing service used by Harborview to obscure ownership. I tracked email chains, and most importantly, I found witnesses. The Parkers sent me their old messages. The woman who'd moved out 3 families over described anxiety attacks from repeated threats. A former board member shared notes he'd been afraid to produce. I backed everything up: safe deposit box, encrypted drive, cloud copies piled in the places they could never find in a single sweep. The plan became simple: assemble the narrative, then present it in public where theater and secrecy couldn't hide the tracks. The emergency HOA meeting was advertised as routine until the enforcement agenda rolled up like a guillotine. I arrived early: documents in a leather case that had belonged to my grandfather. Call it superstition, call it respect, and I sat in the 3rd row while the room filled. Laura Bennett sat at the center of the long table with a smile that had been practiced in front of a mirror. She read the enforcement section with a tone meant to make people nod and feel good about being tough on rules. My name appeared on a projected slide with a list of infractions that looked terrifying out of context. The president recommended immediate action. When the chance to speak finally came, I went to the front with a calm I'd had to work at. I started with their own documents, violation letters in chronological order, laid them out like shells on the table. I showed the community covenants beside each accusation. For paint colors, they referenced a palette that didn't exist. For lawn height, they cited numbers when the rule said 6 inches maximum, and mine measured 3.5. For parking, the restriction applied only to street parking, not driveways. The room went quiet, the way rooms do when someone pulls back a curtain and you see how stagehands move. People started murmuring. I saved the gut punch for last. I opened a folder with deeds and copies of Harborview's registration. Then a photocopy of a disclosure form where Laura Bennett years ago had listed relationships with firms tied to Harborview. The current filings had no such disclosure. Someone had removed it, or it had been left blank when it mattered. I laid it all on the table, and because I wanted them to understand the scale, I connected the dots aloud. 3 houses flagged sold below market, bought by the same LLC connected to Harborview. Disclosure present, then absent. Escalating enforcement before sales. Utilities disconnected based on paperwork that never came from an inspector. Questions erupted. Laura tried to interrupt her voice, finding cracks as the room turned on her. A board member, one who'd been quiet until that moment, stood and admitted he had not been informed of any business connections, and he moved to suspend all enforcement actions pending an independent audit. A voice from the back demanded a vote to remove the president. Hands went up like a tide: 54 in favor, 3 against, 3 abstentions. 2 minutes later, Laura Bennett gathered her papers with shaking hands and left the room. She did not get to explain herself. The board voted unanimously to rescind the enforcement actions against me, to order the utility company to reconnect service immediately, to refund any fees I'd paid, and to hire independent counsel to audit 2 years of board decisions. They also agreed to contact families who had sold their homes under suspicious pressure. In that loud, chaotic moment of accountability, the meeting stopped being about me and started being about the structure that had been corrupted. The president's real estate consulting site went offline within a day. The county opened an investigation into disclosure violations. Harborview distanced itself publicly and quietly paused whatever plans they had. I left the community center with my documents still in my hands. No party, no fireworks, just a cold, exact relief that comes when a long calculation finally balances. The final piece of evidence I'd needed to win wasn't a court order or a settlement. It was the room full of people who could see what the papers said when someone pointed it out, and that moment, that simple act of showing unstitched a lot of carefully sewn deception. Justice that day was immediate and procedural: a vote, a suspension, an audit. It was also imperfect. Some families had already lost homes and would have to fight to reclaim what they lost. But the person driving the scheme had been exposed and her authority evaporated in real time. Don't hand power to people and assume they'll always use it well.